It was supposed to be a simple trip to buy her first car. But when Aaliyah, a young black teen, walked into that dealership, she was treated like she didn't belong. What happened next would not only change her life, but spark a fight for justice that no one saw coming. How far will one girl go to stand up for herself when no one else will? Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more great videos. Aaliyah had always dreamed of owning her first car. It wasn't just about the vehicle itself, but the independence it represented. After years of working part-time jobs during high school, saving every penny, and receiving a scholarship to a good college, she finally had enough. She had researched every model, every price, and had settled on the one she wanted, a shiny new sedan that screamed success. She'd even talked to her mother, Ms. Thomas, a successful lawyer, about the deal, who told her to go for it. It was a milestone, one that Aaliyah could proudly share with her friends and family. She'd worked hard for this, and now she was ready to walk into that dealership and make the purchase. The dealership was sleek and polished, with shiny cars lined up like they were waiting to be admired. Aaliyah felt a small surge of excitement as she pushed open the glass door, the cool air inside instantly different from the sweltering heat outside. She walked up to the front desk with her head held high, her fingers wrapped around the edges of her purse, the anticipation growing with every step. The salespeople, mostly older men in suits, looked up as she approached, their eyes glancing over her quickly, almost as if trying to place her. One of the salespeople, a man named John, gave her a quick once-over. His smile was polite but didn't reach his eyes. He was clearly sizing her up, and Aaliyah noticed it immediately. "Can I help you, miss?" he asked, his voice smooth but lacking warmth. Aaliyah, keeping her composure, nodded. "Yes, I'm here to buy my first car. I've done my research. I'm interested in the sedan model." John's eyes narrowed slightly, as if he hadn't expected her to come in with that level of certainty. He glanced down at her outfit, casual, not too fancy, and then back up at her face, almost questioning if someone like her could afford the kind of car she was asking about. Without missing a beat, he motioned toward a set of cars on the other side of the showroom. "Well, I think the sedan might be a bit out of your range," he said, his tone casual but dismissive. "Perhaps something more along the lines of a pre-owned model might suit you better. Those can be more affordable." Aaliyah felt a tight knot in her stomach, but she refused to let it show. She had prepared herself for a professional exchange, not for this subtle condescension. She kept her voice steady. "I've already checked the prices. I'm ready to buy today. I'm interested in that model." She pointed again to the new sedan she had her eye on. John raised an eyebrow, not exactly thrilled by her response. "Well, I'll have to see what we can do," he muttered under his breath, clearly annoyed. But before he walked away, he added, "I'll get someone to help you with the paperwork. Just give me a moment." As he turned and walked away, Aaliyah couldn't help but feel a wave of frustration. She had done everything right. She had the money, the research, the paperwork. Yet this salesman, just because of how she looked, was treating her as if she didn't belong here, as if she didn't have the same right to buy a car as anyone else. The small voice inside her told her to let it go, but something about the way John had looked at her, the judgment in his eyes, made it impossible to ignore. She decided to wait. She had worked too hard, saved too long, and studied too much to be dismissed this way. As she stood there, the murmurs of other customers and the buzz of the dealership around her only seemed to make her stand out more, as if the judgment in John's eyes was being echoed by the whole room. She forced herself to take a deep breath and remind herself that she deserved to be there just as much as anyone else. The minutes dragged by as Aaliyah stood there, trying to stay composed. She watched as John spoke briefly with a colleague, his tone low, but even from across the showroom, Aaliyah could hear the subtle mockery in his voice. He wasn't just dismissing her. He was underestimating her. She could feel the sting of his assumptions, but she held her ground. Her eyes remained fixed on the sleek car in the distance, the one she had set her heart on. It was a symbol of her independence, a reward for her hard work. There was no way she was going to let anyone take that away from her. After what felt like an eternity, John finally returned. He was accompanied by a woman in her 40s, dressed in a sharp suit that screamed authority. The woman's gaze flicked to Aaliyah, and for a moment there was no recognition. Then she smiled. A smile that didn't feel welcoming, just practiced. "I'm Rachel," she said. "I'll be helping you with the paperwork." Aaliyah nodded, trying to remain polite, but the air between them felt heavy with unspoken judgment. As Rachel began pulling out forms and speaking in that detached, professional tone, Aaliyah couldn't shake the feeling that she was being looked down upon. Rachel's eyes would glance at her, almost as if checking her worthiness to be in the showroom. It was subtle, but Aaliyah felt it. It was as if her presence, the fact that she was even here to buy a car, was somehow surprising. As if someone like her didn't belong. "I'll need to check a few things before we proceed with the purchase," Rachel said, glancing down at her notes. She didn't look up as she continued. "Have you thought about financing? It's a good option for someone who's just starting out." "I don't need financing," Aaliyah replied quickly, trying to keep her voice steady. "I have the full amount ready to pay today." Rachel paused, finally looking up, her eyebrow raised in mild disbelief. "Oh? Well, that's impressive," she said, though it was clear that she didn't believe it. Aaliyah could see it in her eyes. She didn't think a young black girl could possibly afford this car without some kind of help. It was the same assumption John had made. Aaliyah fought the urge to lash out, to call attention to what was happening, but she knew that wasn't the way to win. She needed to be calm, to stay composed. She didn't want to give them any reason to doubt her even further. Instead, she took a deep breath and placed the envelope of cash and paperwork on the counter in front of Rachel, watching her reaction closely. Rachel's eyes lingered on the envelope for a moment, and when she finally reached for it, she did so with an exaggerated caution. Aaliyah could feel the judgment, thick in the air between them, but she remained quiet, holding her gaze steady as Rachel flipped through the documents. Then Rachel looked at Aaliyah one last time, her voice suddenly cold. "I'll just need to get someone to double-check this, make sure everything is in order," Rachel said flatly, before turning her back on Aaliyah without another word. Aaliyah stood still, her fingers gripping the edge of the counter, her heart pounding in her chest. It felt as if she had done everything right, but they were still treating her like an outsider. The knot in her stomach tightened. She had expected this to be a simple process, but it had turned into something else entirely, something that made her feel small. She glanced around, and for the first time, she noticed the other customers in the showroom. The ones who looked like they belonged. The ones who hadn't been questioned, hadn't been doubted. They were being helped, treated with respect, while she stood there, invisible in plain sight. It was in that moment that Aaliyah knew this wasn't just about the car. This was about proving to them and to herself that she belonged. The weight felt unbearable, like every passing second was a reminder that she wasn't being treated the way she should have been. Aaliyah stood there fighting the urge to leave and walk out, but she couldn't. Not now. She had worked too hard for this. She had earned the right to be here just as much as anyone else, and she wasn't about to let their assumptions dictate how this day would go. John and Rachel continued to exchange hushed words with each other, glancing at Aaliyah from time to time. She could tell they were discussing her, whispering about her behind closed lips. Their body language was telling, a mix of confusion, surprise, and maybe even pity. Aaliyah couldn't make out their exact words, but the way they looked at her made it clear they were questioning her every move. Just as the tension started to feel too heavy, the door to the dealership swung open and a woman entered. She was tall, with sharp features and an air of authority that immediately caught the attention of everyone in the room. Her presence was undeniable, and when her gaze landed on Aaliyah, the weight of the situation seemed to shift. This woman wasn't just another customer. She was here for something far more important. Aaliyah recognized her instantly. It was her mother, Ms. Thomas, the respected lawyer who had taught Aaliyah everything she knew about standing up for herself. Her mother was not one to back down when something was wrong, and Aaliyah had always admired her ability to command a room. As Ms. Thomas walked through the showroom, her eyes quickly locked on Aaliyah, and a soft but knowing smile tugged at the corners of her lips. She had been following her daughter's text updates and had arrived, knowing something wasn't right. But it wasn't just Ms. Thomas who had arrived. Aaliyah noticed several other people standing behind her, lawyers, people from her mother's firm, a legal team. Aaliyah's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected this kind of intervention, but as her mother approached the counter, she knew things were about to change. Rachel and John had barely noticed her mother's arrival, too wrapped up in their own assumptions, but now they were forced to look up. Aaliyah's mother walked straight up to them, her posture tall and dignified, her expression calm but stern. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, her voice carrying an unmistakable authority. John's eyes widened, and he fumbled with his papers. Rachel, too, looked taken aback. Neither of them was prepared for the professional presence that Aaliyah's mother brought with her. The energy in the room shifted. What had been a quiet, tense situation was now a moment of reckoning for the two salespeople who had underestimated Aaliyah. "I've been following my daughter's updates, and it seems you're treating her as if she doesn't belong here," Ms. Thomas continued, her eyes sharp and focused. "I'm curious, is this how you treat every customer who walks through your doors, or just the ones who look like my daughter?" The room went silent. The air thickened, and every person within earshot seemed to hold their breath. Aaliyah stood still, her pulse racing, but she could feel a sense of relief creeping in. Her mother had arrived, and with her, a sense of justice that no one would be able to ignore. Rachel and John exchanged a quick, nervous glance. It was clear they hadn't expected this confrontation. They had assumed that they could treat Aaliyah like a mistake, like someone who didn't belong, but they hadn't anticipated the sharp clarity of her mother's legal presence. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," John stammered, his words losing their usual confident edge. "She just seemed too young." "Too young for what?" Miss Thomas interjected, her voice icy, cutting through the weak excuse. "Too young to afford a car? Too young to be treated with respect?" John's mouth opened, but no words came out. Rachel shifted uncomfortably, her usual professional demeanor cracking under the pressure. They hadn't expected anyone to question them, let alone a lawyer who was clearly prepared for a battle. "I'm going to ask you again," Ms. Thomas said, her tone firm but measured. "What is the problem here?" The dealership's silence stretched out, and for a moment, Aaliyah felt a sense of vindication. She wasn't alone anymore. The weight of everything that had been building, the doubts, the microaggressions, the assumptions, was beginning to crumble under the force of her mother's presence. John and Rachel were no longer in control of the situation. They were the ones being questioned now, and they weren't ready for it. The tension in the dealership was palpable. It felt like the world had stopped spinning as Ms. Thomas stood there, holding the room's attention with nothing more than her poised presence. John, visibly flustered, shifted his weight from foot to foot, while Rachel's earlier composed expression melted into uncertainty. Both of them now realized they had made a serious mistake, and it was becoming clear that they weren't going to get away with it. Aaliyah stood beside her mother, her heart still racing, but now filled with a quiet strength. For the first time that day, she felt like she was finally being heard. She could see the discomfort on John and Rachel's faces, their confidence evaporating as Ms. Thomas continued to stand her ground. This wasn't a confrontation about a car, it was about respect, fairness, and the painful reality that prejudice had crept into their dealings with Aaliyah. Rachel cleared her throat, trying to salvage the situation. I apologize for the misunderstanding, but we just need to verify," Ms. Thomas interrupted, her voice calm but undeniably firm. "Verify? My daughter came here prepared to buy a car. She has all the necessary funds and paperwork. What exactly are you verifying?" Aaliyah felt her mother's words cut through the air like a knife. She could see Rachel's discomfort growing with each passing second. Rachel glanced at John for support, but John, now realizing the gravity of the situation, couldn't even bring himself to speak. Ms. Thomas's legal team, who had been standing off to the side, stepped forward. They hadn't said a word yet, but their presence was enough to send a clear message. This was no longer just a simple customer complaint. This was a legal matter. Ms. Thomas had brought the full force of her professional experience to the table, and it was impossible for John and Rachel to ignore. Aaliyah stood a little taller as she watched her mother handle the situation with ease. Her mom had always taught her the importance of speaking up, especially when injustice was involved. Aaliyah had always been proud of her mother's strength and tenacity. But in this moment, she realized just how much she had learned from her. Her mother wasn't just going to let this slide. Aaliyah wasn't just a customer here. She was someone who deserved to be treated with respect, no matter what anyone assumed about her. The silence stretched out for what seemed like forever. It was only broken when one of Ms. Thomas's associates spoke up, a young lawyer with a serious expression. "We're prepared to take this further if necessary. This kind of treatment will not be tolerated. The dealership's actions today are clearly discriminatory, and we're not afraid to escalate this issue. You'll be hearing from us." Rachel's face turned pale. Her lips parted as if she wanted to say something, but no words came out. John finally managed to mutter, We'll make sure everything is in order right away." But it was too late for apologies now. Ms. Thomas, ever calm, simply nodded and turned her attention to Aaliyah. She placed a reassuring hand on her daughter's shoulder, a silent promise that everything would be okay. "Let's go sit down, Aaliyah." "We'll wait for their next move," Ms. Thomas said, her voice low but confident, signaling to her team that they were ready to take the next step. Aaliyah, still processing the shift in power, walked with her mother to a nearby seating area, her mind racing. She had come here expecting to be treated as just another customer. Instead, she was watching her mother dismantle the very biases that had been used against her. It felt like the moment had shifted in her favor, and the weight that had been pressing on her shoulders began to lift. John and Rachel exchanged looks, but neither of them made any attempt to approach Aaliyah or her mother. It was clear now that the legal team wasn't just a threat. They were a promise that something would be done. As Aaliyah and her mother settled into the chairs, Aaliyah couldn't help but glance back at the salespeople. Their faces were red with embarrassment. They knew deep down that they had misjudged this entire situation, and now they were facing the consequences of their actions. The dealership fell into an uneasy quiet. The hum of background conversations from other customers now drowned out by the tension hanging in the air. Aaliyah sat in the comfortable leather chair, her hands resting on her lap, her gaze fixed on the sleek cars displayed in the showroom. She was still processing everything that had happened, the dismissive comments, the assumptions, the sudden shift in control when her mother had arrived. But one thing became clear in that moment. The power had shifted, and it wasn't in the hands of John or Rachel anymore. Ms. Thomas sat beside her, her demeanor calm but intense. Aaliyah could see the slight tension in her mother's jaw, the way her fingers tapped lightly on the armrest, a clear sign that she was waiting for something. Aaliyah knew her mother wasn't the type to back down, and the thought of how this might unfold sent a mixture of nervousness and excitement through her. She had witnessed her mother fight for justice countless times, but never had she imagined she would be the one at the center of it. Aaliyah took a deep breath, her fingers gripping the edge of the armrest as she glanced around. People had started to notice the shift. The whispers had begun, not of judgment, but of curiosity. Aaliyah caught a few passengers glancing her way, some with looks of sympathy, others with concern. She couldn't help but feel a slight rush of pride. She wasn't invisible anymore. The spotlight was on her, and it wasn't because of anything she had done wrong. It was because she was standing up for herself, refusing to be dismissed. John and Rachel, on the other hand, had all but retreated. Rachel had disappeared into the back office, likely scrambling to figure out how to handle the legal team now standing so firmly in place. John lingered by the sales desk, nervously tapping his fingers on the counter, but he wasn't daring to approach Aaliyah or her mother. It was clear they were both in over their heads. The silence stretched on for several more minutes, the tension becoming almost unbearable. Aaliyah could see the discomfort in the air around them. Customers were no longer focused on the cars. They were watching the confrontation unfold, silently judging the salespeople. A few moments later, a man in a well-tailored suit entered the showroom. A new figure, likely a higher-up in the dealership. Aaliyah immediately recognized the change in atmosphere when he entered. His presence alone carried authority, and it didn't take long for him to spot Ms. Thomas and Aaliyah sitting in the corner. He approached them with a measured stride, his face tight with nervousness, but his posture remained composed. "Good afternoon. I'm Greg Marshall, the dealership manager," he introduced himself, his voice just a little too smooth to be entirely genuine. He extended his hand, but his eyes were on Ms. Thomas. "I understand there's been a misunderstanding here today, and I'd like to resolve it as quickly as possible." Ms. Thomas stood up slowly, her eyes never leaving his. Aaliyah could feel the shift in energy as her mother took control of the conversation once more. "I'm not sure there's much to resolve, Mr. Marshall. My daughter came here with every intention of purchasing a car today. What I've seen from your staff is clear discrimination based on assumptions about her ability to afford the vehicle. What exactly is there to resolve?" Greg's eyes flicked toward Aaliyah, then back to her mother. "Well, we take pride in offering excellent customer service to all our clients," he said, trying to sound reassuring. "And I understand that we may have made a mistake, but we simply need to ensure everything is in order. It's just procedure." "Procedure?" Ms. Thomas's voice was low, but it carried an undeniable edge. "I'm afraid your procedure is built on prejudice. You didn't think my daughter could afford this car because of the way she looks, and that's not a mistake. It's discrimination." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "I don't want apologies. I want accountability." The words hung in the air. Greg shifted uncomfortably, his previous confidence beginning to crack. He glanced around the showroom, perhaps searching for support, but he found none. His eyes returned to Aaliyah, who sat with her arms folded, her posture calm but firm. "This isn't how we do business," Greg finally muttered, the guilt in his tone palpable. He seemed to be attempting to regain control of the situation, but was failing miserably. "I'll have to look into this further, but—" "No," Ms. Thomas cut him off. "This needs to be handled now. This isn't just a simple mistake. You've made assumptions about my daughter, and now I'm here to ensure you understand the consequences of those actions." Aaliyah felt her heart race. She had never imagined that something like this would happen to her. She had always tried to blend in, to do everything right. But today, her mother had taught her something far more important. Sometimes standing up for yourself wasn't just necessary, it was essential. Greg, realizing he had no way out, muttered something about needing to consult with the corporate office. He started backing away, his body language a clear sign of surrender. Ms. Thomas watched him retreat, her eyes still sharp, her posture unwavering. As the man left to make his call, Aaliyah couldn't help but feel a rush of relief. Her mother had stepped in, and the entire situation had shifted. The uncertainty she had felt moments ago had faded, replaced by a newfound confidence. She had taken control of her own story, and that meant everything. The dealership was eerily quiet now. The usual buzz of car salespeople talking to customers, the soft clink of keys, and the distant hum of the air conditioning had all been replaced by the awkwardness of waiting. Aaliyah glanced at her mother, who remained calm and composed, but Aaliyah could see the sharp focus in her eyes. She wasn't just waiting for Greg to return, she was waiting for a resolution. Aaliyah's fingers drummed softly on the armrest of her chair, her mind racing. She had never thought much about discrimination until now. Sure, she had read about it, heard about it in the news, but she had never thought she would be the one at the center of it. It was one thing to be aware of injustice. It was another thing entirely to experience it. The feeling had made her stomach churn, but her mother's calm demeanor had grounded her. Aaliyah realized, with a growing sense of clarity, that standing up for what was right was not just about the moment, it was about the long-term fight for fairness, the kind of fight her mother had been leading her whole life. As the minutes passed, Aaliyah watched as more customers filtered in and out of the showroom. Some glanced at her, their curiosity piqued by the change in the atmosphere, but no one dared to ask questions. It was clear that the power had shifted, and Aaliyah was no longer just a bystander in the situation. She was an active participant in something bigger than herself. After what felt like an eternity, Greg finally returned, looking visibly uncomfortable. He had been gone long enough to make it clear that he had consulted someone higher up, the corporate office perhaps. His face was now set in a tight, forced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Ms. Thomas, Aaliyah," he began, addressing them both, "I've spoken with corporate, and they've assured me they'll look into this situation. We take your concerns very seriously." Ms. Thomas didn't respond immediately. She let the silence linger, allowing Greg's words to settle in the air between them. It wasn't just an apology he had brought back, he had brought a promise of action. But Aaliyah could tell from the way her mother's jaw tightened that this wasn't going to be enough. "You're not hearing me, Greg," Ms. Thomas finally said, her voice measured but firm. "This isn't just about corporate policies or looking into the situation. This is about how you and your staff have treated my daughter. You've made assumptions about her worth, and that's not something that can just be brushed aside with promises." Aaliyah couldn't help but admire her mother's ability to hold her ground, to refuse to let them downplay what had happened. She wasn't going to allow them to apologize their way out of it. This was about accountability, and Ms. Thomas was going to make sure they understood that. "I understand your frustration," Greg said, his smile faltering, "but I assure you, this isn't the way we want to do business. We can make it right. I can personally assist Aaliyah with the purchase of the car today. I'll make sure there's no issue with the financing or paperwork." Aaliyah could see the tension in her mother's shoulders ease slightly at the offer, but she knew this wasn't the real issue. It wasn't just about getting the car. It was about the respect that Aaliyah deserved from the very moment she walked into this dealership. The treatment she had received was the real problem. "No," Ms. Thomas said softly but firmly, "this isn't about you personally assisting her. It's about the way you and the staff here treated her. It's about the assumptions you made based on her age, her appearance, and her background. You made her feel like she didn't belong here. That's not something you can fix with a quick transaction." Greg's face flushed a deep red. He was running out of excuses, and the weight of his own actions was sinking in. I didn't realize," he stammered, his voice cracking slightly. "No," Ms. Thomas interrupted. "You didn't realize because you never took the time to truly see Aaliyah. You never bothered to think that she might be here for the same reasons as anyone else, to purchase a car and to be treated with dignity." The silence that followed was deafening. Greg stood there, his shoulders slumped, realizing the magnitude of the mistake they had made. He wasn't just facing an upset customer. He was facing someone who had the power to make real change, someone who would hold him and his dealership accountable for their actions. Aaliyah looked at her mother, feeling a sense of pride swell in her chest. Her mother wasn't just standing up for her, she was standing up for every person who had ever been judged unfairly, for every person who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. "I think you understand now," Ms. Thomas said, her voice softening just enough to let him know she wasn't going to drag him down any further. This isn't just about my daughter, it's about every customer who walks in here. It's about changing the way you see people, not just their appearance, but their worth." Greg nodded, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for the right words, but none came. He knew he had lost, and he knew there was no easy way out. "We'll take care of it," he said finally, the words hollow, but a promise nonetheless. "I'll make sure to personally oversee the training of our staff on how to treat every customer with respect, and I'll ensure that no one faces what Aaliyah faced today." The weight of those words hung in the air. It wasn't an easy fix, and Aaliyah knew this wasn't the last time this kind of conversation would need to happen, but it was a start. It was progress, and for the first time that day, she felt a glimmer of hope that things might actually change. Aaliyah and her mother stood up, the weight of the conversation lifting slightly as Greg fumbled with his words. The tension had shifted. No longer were they in the midst of an uncomfortable confrontation. Now, there was a feeling of resolution, however temporary. Ms. Thomas had made it clear the treatment her daughter had endured was unacceptable, and the dealership had no choice but to reckon with it. Aaliyah glanced around the showroom again, seeing a few employees quietly observing, no doubt waiting for some kind of fallout. But the only thing that remained was a sense of closure, a quiet satisfaction that the wheels of justice had begun to turn. The salespeople who had once looked down on her now seemed smaller in comparison. Even Greg, who had tried to handle the situation with a corporate smile, was no longer in control of the room. Ms. Thomas had taken back the power, and in doing so, had given Aaliyah a sense of ownership over her story. Greg cleared his throat, visibly rattled, but trying to regain some semblance of professionalism. "I'll have the paperwork prepared," he said, glancing between Aaliyah and her mother. "Everything will be in order. I'll make sure it's handled personally." Aaliyah looked at her mother, who nodded in approval. Ms. Thomas didn't need any further assurances from Greg. She had made it clear that they wouldn't settle for anything less than complete respect. And if they didn't follow through on their promises, there would be consequences far beyond a simple customer complaint. "We'll be waiting," Ms. Thomas said, her voice calm but resolute. "And we expect the staff here to understand that this is about more than just one sale. It's about changing the culture of how customers are treated. No one should ever feel the way Aaliyah did when she walked in here." With those final words, Aaliyah and her mother walked toward the waiting area, the sense of power now firmly in their hands. Aaliyah could feel a rush of emotion, relief, pride, and even a little bit of disbelief. The events of the day had unfolded so quickly, but now it was clear that they had left a lasting impact on everyone who had witnessed them. As they sat down, Aaliyah couldn't help but smile slightly. Her mother's presence had made all the difference. It wasn't just about getting the car, it was about proving that no one, regardless of their age, race, or background, should ever be treated as less than. Minutes later, Greg returned looking much more subdued than when he had left. He carried a folder with the paperwork neatly stacked inside, his eyes downcast. There was no more forced smile, no more attempts to cover up his earlier mistakes with empty pleasantries. It was clear now that he understood the gravity of what had happened. "I've processed everything," he said quietly, placing the folder in front of Aaliyah. "The car is yours, as promised. No more delays. I've made sure the financing is clear, and there won't be any more questions about your eligibility." Aaliyah reached for the folder, her fingers brushing against the cold paper. She could feel the weight of everything that had just happened, the frustration, the anger, the sense of being dismissed. But now it was over. She had stood her ground, and she was walking away with what she had earned. She glanced at her mother, who gave her a slight nod of approval. Ms. Thomas's face was composed, but Aaliyah could see the pride in her eyes. They had won. This wasn't just about getting the car, it was about standing up to the system that tried to shut them down and making sure that people like Aaliyah would never have to face that kind of treatment again. "Thank you," Aaliyah said, her voice steady. Greg didn't respond at first, clearly unsure how to react. But Aaliyah could tell that he was taking her words seriously. The damage had been done, but perhaps, just perhaps, this would be the wake-up call the dealership needed. "Is there anything else we need to discuss?" Aaliyah asked, her voice firm but polite. Greg shook his head quickly. "No, I think that's everything," he said. "I'll make sure this matter is addressed with the rest of the staff, and I'll personally follow up with corporate to ensure that proper training is conducted. We'll be reviewing how we handle customers like you in the future." The apology was faint, and Aaliyah could see that he was still grappling with the situation, but it was enough. The dealership was going to make changes. That was all she needed to hear. As Aaliyah stood up, ready to finalize her purchase, she couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. It wasn't just about the car anymore. It was about her right to be there, her right to be treated with respect. She had faced down prejudice head-on and walked away victorious. As she left the dealership with her mother, the finality of the moment settled in. The quiet conversations from earlier had now given way to whispers of approval. Aaliyah's story was already spreading among the staff, and she knew this wasn't just a victory for her. It was a message that would resonate far beyond the walls of the dealership. She had done more than buy a car that day. She had made a stand, and that was something she would never forget. As they walked out of the dealership, Aaliyah couldn't help but feel a weight lift off her shoulders. The feeling of victory wasn't as loud or dramatic as she had expected, but it was steady. A sense of pride swelled inside her. She had walked into that showroom unsure of how she would be treated, unsure of whether her voice would even matter. But now she was leaving with her head held high, knowing that she had made a difference, not just for herself, but for others who might face the same prejudice. Ms. Thomas walked beside her, her steps confident and deliberate. Aaliyah couldn't help but admire her mother's poise. She had always known that her mom was strong. She had seen her fight for justice in the courtroom countless times, but to see it firsthand, how quickly she had turned the situation around, left Aaliyah in awe. Her mother had always taught her that standing up for what was right wasn't about shouting the loudest or getting the most attention. It was about doing the right thing, even when it was hard. "I'm proud of you, Aaliyah," Ms. Thomas said, her voice soft but sincere. "You didn't back down, even when it would have been easier to just walk away. You made sure your voice was heard, and that's something that takes courage." Aaliyah looked at her mother, feeling a surge of emotion. She had always known her mother was a fighter, but now she realized that the courage she had inherited wasn't just about fighting battles. It was about standing up for herself and others, no matter the cost. "I couldn't have done it without you, Mom," Aaliyah replied, her voice filled with gratitude. "You taught me to never let anyone make me feel less than." They reached the parking lot, and Aaliyah's eyes landed on the car that she had worked so hard to get. The car wasn't just a means of transportation, it was a symbol of everything she had accomplished: the hard work, the dedication, and now the victory against the assumptions that had tried to hold her back. Ms. Thomas smiled as she placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "This is your moment, Aaliyah. You earned this." Aaliyah opened the door to her new car and slid into the driver's seat, feeling the leather against her hands. As she started the engine, she couldn't help but glance back at the dealership one last time. The building, once a place of doubt and judgment, now felt distant and irrelevant. She was no longer a girl who had been questioned based on her appearance. She was a young woman who had claimed her space, who had made her own path. The drive home was quiet, but it was filled with a sense of reflection. Aaliyah's mind replayed the events of the day, thinking back on the tense moments at the dealership, the feeling of being looked down upon, and the quiet determination that had built inside her. The anger and frustration she had initially felt had been replaced with something more powerful, a sense of clarity. She had stood up for herself, and in doing so, she had created a space for others who might be silenced by prejudice. Aaliyah glanced over at her mother, who sat beside her, her eyes focused on the road ahead. It wasn't just the car that made this day special, it was the lesson she had learned. This wasn't about one fight, this was about recognizing the smaller injustices in everyday life and knowing that it was okay to stand up against them. It was about understanding that change didn't happen in one grand gesture, but in small, quiet actions that could shift the course of things over time. "You've taught me more than just how to fight for what's right," Aaliyah said, her voice thoughtful. "You've taught me how to use my voice, even when it feels like no one's listening." Ms. Thomas turned to her with a soft smile. "That's what it's all about, using your voice to create change. We can't wait for someone else to do it for us." Aaliyah nodded, her heart swelling with pride. The day had been full of surprises, but in the end she had learned one of the most valuable lessons of all, that her voice mattered, that she had the power to make a difference, no matter the situation. As they pulled into the driveway, Aaliyah looked at her mother one more time, a quiet promise passing between them. They had made it through this day together, but it was only the beginning. There would be more battles, more moments when they'd have to stand tall and fight for what was right. But Aaliyah knew, with her mother by her side, she would never back down. And as she looked at the car in front of her house, she realized that the journey she had started wasn't just about the car, it was about the future she was shaping for herself, one step at a time. The next few days felt like a blur. Aaliyah was still riding the high of her victory, but she knew it was just the beginning. Every time she looked at her car, she was reminded not only of the hard work she had put in to afford it, but also of the larger lesson she had learned. The experience at the dealership had changed her. It had opened her eyes to the subtle ways people can be dismissed based on assumptions and biases, and how easily they can be ignored or silenced. But it had also shown her the power of standing firm in the face of that injustice. Aaliyah found herself thinking about the other customers who might have walked into that dealership only to leave feeling the way she had, less than unworthy. She wondered how many other people had faced the same kind of prejudice, whether they were treated with suspicion because of their appearance, their age, or their background. She realized that while her mother's presence had been a game changer in her situation, not everyone had that kind of support. It was a sobering thought, and one that made her feel even more determined to stand up for what was right, especially when others couldn't. Later that week, Aaliyah returned to the dealership, this time not to buy a car, but to see the changes that had been promised. Her mother had been in contact with the corporate office, and she was determined to make sure the dealership followed through on their commitment to diversity and respect training. Aaliyah wasn't sure what to expect, but she knew it was important to hold them accountable. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore, she was fighting for everyone who had ever felt dismissed or underestimated. When they arrived at the dealership, things seemed different. The salespeople were all actively engaged with customers, offering warm smiles and genuinely helping people without the subtle judgment that had been so evident before. Aaliyah felt a sense of relief, but it was still early. She knew that real change would take time, and she was determined to see it through. Ms. Thomas led the way into the showroom, her presence still commanding attention. As they walked through the dealership, Aaliyah noticed the shift in atmosphere. It wasn't just the employees who seemed different. There was a new energy in the room. The air felt lighter, as if the tension that had once hung so thick was finally dissipating. But Aaliyah wasn't fooled. She knew that the true test would come when they spoke to the manager, Greg, and to the staff who had been involved in the situation. Greg spotted them from across the showroom, his eyes immediately locking onto Ms. Thomas with a mix of apprehension and respect. He walked toward them, his posture a little less stiff than the first time they'd met. There was a noticeable difference in how he approached them now. No more defensive attitude or forced politeness. He seemed genuinely humbled, as though the conversation they had had a few days ago had left a lasting impact. "Ms. Thomas, Aaliyah," Greg greeted them, his voice warmer than before. "I wanted to personally thank you both for giving us the opportunity to improve. I know we made some serious mistakes, and we've been working hard to make sure they don't happen again." Ms. Thomas nodded, her expression soft but still serious. "I'm glad to hear that. But actions speak louder than words. You've promised us training, but now I need to see the follow-through. I want to make sure that what happened to Aaliyah doesn't happen to anyone else." Greg looked at her with sincerity. "We've started the training as promised. We've brought in experts on diversity, equity, and inclusion. We've had a few sessions already, and we're scheduled for more. We're also making sure that every staff member is held accountable for how they treat our customers. I can't undo what happened, but I'm committed to making things right." Aaliyah glanced around the showroom, seeing familiar faces among the sales staff. There was a subtle difference in their behavior. They were interacting with customers more respectfully, without the judgmental glances she had once received. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. A small victory, but a victory nonetheless. "I'm glad to hear it," Aaliyah said, her voice firm but not unkind. "But I want to make sure this is more than just a few sessions. You need to create an environment where every customer, no matter their background, feels valued and respected. That's the kind of change I'm looking for." Greg nodded earnestly. "Absolutely. We're not stopping with the training. We're also revamping our hiring practices and customer service protocols to ensure we're reaching everyone and giving them the best experience possible." Ms. Thomas gave him a sharp look, assessing him carefully. "I'll be following up. This can't be just lip service. You need to walk the walk." "I understand," Greg said, his voice more earnest now. "And I will. We're committed to making these changes, not just for you, but for every customer who comes through our doors." Aaliyah felt a sense of satisfaction as she listened to him. She knew that the road ahead would be long, but seeing the dealership's commitment to improvement made her believe that things could change. This wasn't just a victory for her. It was a small but important step toward a future where people weren't judged based on assumptions. "We'll be watching," Ms. Thomas said, her tone firm but not unkind. "I expect to see real results." As they turned to leave, Aaliyah felt her heart swell with pride. She had done more than stand up for herself. She had pushed for change. She knew that the road to true equality would be long, but today, in this small corner of the world, something had shifted. And that was enough for now. The following weeks passed by quickly, but Aaliyah couldn't shake the sense of accomplishment that came from the events at the dealership. Every time she looked at her car, a reminder of her journey, she was filled with pride. Not just for her new car, but for how far she had come in standing up for herself, her rights, and the rights of others. It wasn't just about a transaction anymore. It was about a shift in perspective, about making sure no one else would ever feel the sting of being underestimated. Aaliyah had heard from her mother about the continued training sessions at the dealership. Ms. Thomas had been in contact with Greg a few times, and while the changes hadn't been overnight, Aaliyah could tell they were taking steps in the right direction. She had even received an email from Greg personally, thanking her again for her role in bringing awareness to the dealership's shortcomings. His tone was respectful, and though Aaliyah remained cautious, she appreciated that he was trying to follow through on his promises. But more than that, she started to realize that her experience had sparked something inside her, a deeper understanding of the world around her, and a new sense of responsibility to use her voice when it mattered. The car dealership incident wasn't an isolated event. It was a microcosm of a much larger issue, how society often judges people based on superficial factors and how that judgment can shape the way people are treated. It made Aaliyah more determined than ever to speak out, to make sure that the change she had seen was only the beginning. One day, as Aaliyah sat at home with her mother, they discussed what came next. Ms. Thomas had always taught her that change didn't stop after one battle, that it was an ongoing process. And as Aaliyah thought about it, she realized that she wanted to do more. She wanted to get involved, to make sure that her experience could be used to help others who might not have the support she did. She had the tools now, the confidence, the clarity, and the understanding that even small actions could lead to larger movements. "Mom," Aaliyah began, her voice thoughtful, "what if I started something? A platform maybe, something to share stories like mine and raise awareness about discrimination and bias." Ms. Thomas turned to her with a knowing smile. "I think that's a great idea. You've already taken the first step by standing up for yourself, but now you can help others find their voice too. People need to hear these stories, and they need to understand that change isn't something that just happens. It's something we make happen." Aaliyah felt a surge of excitement. She had always been passionate about justice, but now she had a purpose beyond her own experience. She was going to take what she had learned and use it to make an impact. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but it was one she was ready to take. Aaliyah spent the next few weeks researching, planning, and building a platform, a website where she could share her own story, but also collect and highlight the stories of others who had faced similar experiences. It would be a space for people to come together, to learn from each other, and to help amplify voices that had been silenced for far too long. The more she worked on it, the more she realized that this wasn't just about her. It was about creating a community of support, a place where people who had been treated unjustly could find a voice and feel heard. She called it Voices for Change, a simple name that captured the essence of what she wanted to do. The website would feature articles, personal stories, and resources for people looking to make a difference in their own communities. It would also offer educational content about bias, prejudice, and how to confront discrimination head-on. With her mother's encouragement and the support of a few trusted friends, Aaliyah launched the platform. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. And to her surprise, the response was overwhelming. Within days, people started reaching out, sharing their own stories, offering support, and even asking for guidance on how to stand up against injustice in their own lives. The platform quickly gained traction, with followers on social media and a growing community of people eager to share their experiences and learn from each other. Aaliyah was amazed at how quickly it had taken off. She realized that her story, her moment of standing up to the dealership, was part of something much larger than she had ever imagined. It was a catalyst for change, a reminder that every voice mattered and that change was possible, no matter how small the action seemed. As she sat at her desk, reading through the messages of support and gratitude from people all over the country, Aaliyah felt a deep sense of purpose. She wasn't just creating a website, she was creating a movement. And with every post, every story shared, she was helping to break down the walls of prejudice that had long stood in the way of fairness and equality. "I never thought it would turn into something like this," Aaliyah said to her mother one evening as they sat together, looking at the growing number of messages on her phone. Her mother smiled, a look of pride in her eyes. "That's because you're not just fighting for yourself anymore. You're fighting for everyone who's ever felt like they didn't have a voice." Aaliyah nodded, a quiet smile tugging at the corners of her lips. She realized her journey had only just begun, and she was ready for whatever came next. The change she had sparked at the dealership was only a small piece of a much bigger puzzle, and now, with the platform she had created, she was ready to make sure that puzzle was completed, piece by piece. As the weeks went by, Voices for Change continued to grow. Aaliyah's platform had become more than just a website. It had become a movement. Stories flooded in from all over, with people sharing their experiences of prejudice, discrimination, and bias. Aaliyah couldn't help but feel a sense of awe as she read through each one. Each story was a testament to the resilience of people who had fought for their dignity, and every message reinforced the importance of the work she was doing. The website became a gathering place for people to share their personal experiences and offer support to one another. Aaliyah had initially set it up as a place for people to read and reflect, but soon It had evolved into a community. It wasn't just about awareness, it was about action. She began organizing webinars, virtual meetups, and even local events to help educate people on how to address prejudice in their own communities. Slowly but surely, Voices for Change was becoming a force to be reckoned with. Aaliyah found herself invited to speak at events, online forums, school assemblies, even community workshops, where she shared her story and encouraged others to take a stand. She wasn't just speaking for herself anymore. She was speaking for everyone who had ever been silenced. With each speech, each conversation, Aaliyah became more confident in her ability to make an impact. She realized that her journey, her fight at the dealership, was not a single, isolated event. It had been the beginning of something much larger. One evening, after a particularly powerful conversation with a group of high school students, Aaliyah sat down with her mother to reflect on everything that had happened. "Mom," she said, her voice thoughtful, "this isn't just about me anymore. It's about creating real change. It's about making sure no one else ever has to feel like I did at that dealership." Ms. Thomas, who had always been her biggest supporter, nodded with pride. "That's exactly what you're doing, Aaliyah. You've started something that can change lives, and it's going to keep growing. It's not just about fighting against discrimination, it's about fighting for the future, for a world where everyone feels seen, heard, and respected." Aaliyah smiled, her heart swelling with the realization of how far she had come. She had never imagined that standing up for herself in a dealership would lead her here, creating a platform that helped people all over the country find their voices too. It was bigger than she could have ever anticipated, but it felt right. She knew she was on the right path. One afternoon, as Aaliyah checked her phone, she saw a notification from a well-known media outlet. They had reached out to her, asking for an interview about Voices for Change. Her heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected the platform to attract so much attention from the press, but it was clear that the work she was doing had resonated with a wider audience. This was a chance to share her story on a larger scale, to bring even more awareness to the issues she cared so deeply about. The interview was scheduled for the following week, and Aaliyah spent the days leading up to it preparing herself. She didn't want to just talk about her experience at the dealership. She wanted to share the bigger picture, to explain how prejudice and bias permeate so many parts of life. It wasn't just about her story anymore. It was about the collective stories of everyone who had ever been marginalized. The day of the interview, Aaliyah was a little nervous, but more excited. As she sat in front of the camera, the interviewer greeted her with a warm smile, making her feel at ease. "Aaliyah," the interviewer began, "you've become a voice for so many people who've faced discrimination. How did you go from that moment at the dealership to creating Voices for Change?" Aaliyah took a deep breath, collecting her thoughts. "It wasn't easy," she said, her voice steady. "At first, it felt like I was just trying to defend myself. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't just about me. It was about something bigger. It was about making sure no one else ever had to feel the way I did. I wanted to create a space where people could share their stories, but more importantly, I wanted to give people the tools to fight back. We all deserve to be treated with dignity and respect, no matter where we come from, what we look like, or how old we are." The interviewer nodded, clearly moved by her words. "And since launching the platform, what kind of impact have you seen? What has the response been like?" Aaliyah smiled, her heart full. "The response has been incredible. People are sharing their stories, connecting with each other, and finding the strength to stand up for themselves. It's not just about raising awareness, it's about empowering people. We're building a community, and that's where the real change starts. It's about breaking down the walls of prejudice, one story at a time." As the interview continued, Aaliyah felt a sense of purpose that was stronger than ever. She wasn't just telling her story anymore. She was helping others tell theirs too. And in doing so, she was helping to create a world where everyone, no matter their background, could stand tall and be proud of who they were. By the end of the interview, Aaliyah felt like she had taken another step forward in her journey. The platform was growing, and more people were getting involved. It was no longer just a dream, it was becoming a movement. And Aaliyah knew, deep down, that this was just the beginning. The road ahead would be long, but she was ready to walk it, one step at a time, with her mother by her side, and a growing community of supporters behind her. Together, they were creating a world where every voice could be heard. In the months that followed, Voices for Change continued to gain momentum. The media interview had opened doors, leading to more opportunities to speak at events and share the platform with organizations committed to social justice. Aaliyah had become a recognized advocate for change, but she remained humble, always redirecting the attention to the stories that mattered. The stories of everyday people who had faced adversity and discrimination, but found strength in their voices. Her website now had a robust community of followers, people from all walks of life sharing their experiences, offering advice, and supporting each other. Aaliyah had created a space where vulnerability wasn't seen as weakness, but as a powerful tool for connection. The stories were diverse. Some were heartbreaking, others uplifting, but they all carried the same message: we all have the right to be heard, and we all have the power to make change. The work was far from over. Aaliyah knew that the impact of Voices for Change wasn't just about the stories shared or the awareness raised. It was about creating tangible action. She began collaborating with schools, businesses, and local government offices to implement more comprehensive diversity training programs. Her focus wasn't just on addressing individual prejudices, it was on changing the systems that allowed them to thrive. One afternoon, while meeting with a local school board to discuss how to incorporate anti-bias education into the curriculum, Aaliyah reflected on everything she had achieved. She thought back to the days when she had walked into that dealership, unsure of herself, facing discrimination she wasn't prepared for. At that moment, she had only hoped for the chance to be treated with respect. Now, she was creating an entire movement, one that was pushing for fairness and equality not just in one place, but in many. Her mother had been her guiding light through it all, offering unwavering support, advice, and encouragement. Ms. Thomas had always believed in her daughter's strength, but Aaliyah now realized that it wasn't just about being strong in the face of adversity. It was about using that strength to empower others. She wasn't fighting alone anymore. She had a community, a movement, and a future she was helping to shape. As the sun set on another successful event, Aaliyah sat in her office, scrolling through the messages that had come in that day. There were stories of people finding their voices, people who had taken the courage to stand up to discrimination and prejudice in their own lives. She couldn't help but smile as she read through them. These were the moments that made everything worth it. This was the change she had hoped for, the change she had started. Aaliyah had come a long way since that day at the dealership. She was no longer the uncertain young woman who had been dismissed because of her appearance. She was a leader now, a voice for those who had been silenced. But she knew that this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. She glanced over at her mother, who was sitting across from her, reading through some papers. Ms. Thomas looked up, meeting her daughter's gaze. There was a quiet understanding between them, a shared recognition of the journey they had both taken together. "You've done something incredible, Aaliyah," her mother said softly. "You've turned your pain into purpose, and you've given others the strength to do the same." Aaliyah nodded, her heart full. "I couldn't have done it without you, Mom. You taught me how to use my voice, how to stand up for what's right. Now, I'm teaching others to do the same." They both sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the journey settling in. Aaliyah had built something lasting, something that would continue to grow and inspire others for years to come. She had turned a moment of personal injustice into a platform for change. And in doing so, she had created a future where everyone, regardless of who they were, would feel heard, seen, and respected. The road ahead was still long, but Aliyah was ready. She had the strength, the community, and the purpose to keep fighting, and with every step she knew that the world was becoming a little bit more just, a little bit more fair, one voice at a time.